Good afternoon. Thanks everyone for joining us on the call and through Facebook. My name is Rikki Baker-Keutch and I'm the Mid-Atlantic campus organizer for J Street and a J Street U's national board. In this call, we will be discussing President Trump's executive order on combating anti-Semitism with Kenneth Stern, the director of the Bard Center for the Study of Hate and former director of the Division on Anti-Semitism and Extremism at the American Jewish Committee for over 25 years, and the author of the forthcoming The Conflict Over the Conflict, the Israel-Palestine Campus Debate. Also joining us to provide additional commentary from J Street's perspective is our Senior Vice President of Government Affairs, Dylan Williams. So before we hear from Kenneth, I want to provide some campus perspective. J Street has decried Trump's executive order as a harmful measure designed to suppress free speech on college campuses, not fight anti-Semitism. And already, Representative Denver Riggleman, a Republican from a district in Virginia covering Charlottesville, has written to Education Secretary Betsy DeVos asking her to review federal funding for Georgetown University's Center for Contemporary Arab Studies in light of the executive order. Ellie Cooper, a senior at Florida State University, is joining the call to give us a current campus perspective.
Hi, everybody. So like Rikki said, I'm a senior at Florida State University, and I just wanted to provide a glimpse into what's been happening at my campus, and just wanted to frame that this is not representative of every student at every campus. This is my feelings and my experience at FSU. So Florida State has an event where third-party non-student vendors are allowed to come to campus and sell goods every week at Market Wednesday. And one of these vendors who's been present at Florida State for the entirety of my time there, so the last 4 years and many years beyond that, has been selling flags. And it recently became widely known that of all of the different flags that he was selling, among them were over 30 flags with Nazi iconography. In the weeks after this became publicized through a student newspaper, I helped coordinate a student response and was meeting with Florida State administrators to understand how this was allowed in the first place and what the university would be doing moving forward. And as this process was unfolding of me meeting with administrators, speaking before student government, meeting with different professors, the Trump administration announced the executive order. And my immediate response was a sense of confusion, we could say. So my campus has a Students for Justice in Palestine chapter. And while they do things that I often disagree with, and often use rhetoric that I find problematic, it's concerning to me that this executive order is prioritizing or centering anti-Semitism on the left. When on my campus, the threats to my safety as an American Jew is coming not from Students for Justice in Palestine, but from these sources on the right. Like this man who's selling flags that are used by active white supremacist groups. So as we explore the meaning of the executive order today, and as we move forward, it's my hope that as we respond to anti-Semitism on college campuses, which is very real and does exist in a multitude of different ways, that we keep an understanding of where the most urgent, threatening anti-Semitism is coming from and respond accordingly. Thank you all.
Thanks so much, Ellie, for sharing that story. For those of you just joining, you're joining the J Street call about Trump's most recent executive order on combating anti-Semitism. And joining us is expert Kenneth Stern, who will share his perspective from a legal standpoint and a scholarly standpoint. And Dylan Williams is also joining us to explain J Street's perspective. If anyone has questions, please leave comments on our Facebook video. We have a Q&A going in the Zoom call, and you can also email us questions at info@jstreet.org. So thank you, Ellie, again. And Ken, from FSU to Princeton to Berkeley, we're hearing stories of increased anti-Semitism on campus, but also a concern that the executive order is misguided and a fear that criticism of Israel will be conflated with anti-Semitism. Against this background, could you run us through the executive order Trump released last week and what it says, as well as the impact it will have on college campuses and beyond?
Sure. Thank you, Rikki, and thank you, everybody, for inviting me to participate with you today. What I want to do, actually, to answer that question really would be to go and spend a few minutes giving the background to how we got there to the executive order, because it didn't just come out of thin air. It's actually, as you'll see, it's really been close to, almost 15 years or more in the making in terms of what these efforts are about. So what basically happened is, some of you will remember, some of you are too young, but some of you will remember that right after the Second Intifada and the peace process collapsed, there was a series of attacks that continued against Jews in Europe. And that was obviously a problem. And one of the responses to that, there was a group called the European Monitoring Center that was tasked with looking at issues of racism, xenophobia, and anti-Semitism. And they put together a report that was very interesting in terms of looking at how these incidents were unfolding. But there was a problem with it, actually two problems. One is they said, look, we have all these data collectors in Europe. They don't know what to look for. There's no common definition of anti-Semitism. We don't know from one country to the next, and how are we going to compare it over time and across borders? And then what they decided to do as an answer to that was they said anti-Semitism was a series of stereotypes about Jews. Even though I have problems with that as being somewhat intellectually backward, the real reason they did that is they wanted to think about a Jew on the streets of Paris gets attacked as a stand-in for an Israeli. What in that case should that be counted or not counted? And they said, well, the stereotypes that they're applied to Israelis and then applied back, that would be anti-Semitism. But if somebody is just upset with Israeli policy and attack, that shouldn't be counted. And that.
Sorry, Ken, before you continue, we're having a small mic issue. If you could speak up just a little louder for our Facebook Live watchers.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Anyway, so the response to that was right at the time that there was a firebombing of a Jewish school in Montreal, where somebody was upset as Israel had killed a Hamas leader, not counted as anti-Semitism according to that definition. So I and a number of other colleagues worked on creating a definition that would be useful across borders, across time, would include things like attacking Jews in response to being upset about Israeli actions and so forth. And that was called the EUMC Working Definition of Anti-Semitism. So that came out in 2005. So hold that for a second. There were, there were examples about things related to Israel, including anti-Zionism, calling the denying Jews' right to self-determination as a racist enterprise is something to be counted for wanting to take the temperature of anti-Semitism in Europe, not to label anybody an anti-Semite. So that's one thing, 2005. 2010, the Department of Education in the United States issues what's called the Dear Colleague letter that said for Title VI, which is the part of the Civil Rights Act that protects students and others on campus from discrimination, intimidation, and harassment, that Jews and Sikhs and Muslims as ethnicities should be included because Title VI didn't include religion. So there was a question about whether Jews and Sikhs and Muslims should be included, and the answer was yes, and I supported that. In fact, there was a place outside of Binghamton called Vestal School District, where some Jewish students were having swastikas carved on their desks, and there was a Kick a Jew Day. And I was their complainant, and we used that new tool and filed a Title VI case, and we got a settlement. And Title VI, in theory, is draconian in the sense that it could strip all money from a school district or a college. But in this case, we agreed to the school would step up and protect the Jewish students better. But what happened was that groups on the right of the Jewish community, ZOA and AMCA and some others, had this idea: take the definition of anti-Semitism, wed it to the new power under Title VI, and start bringing cases. So they started bringing some cases alleging Title VI violations. Now, some of the allegations did include things that were actions, spitting and so forth. But the bulk of them, the real purpose of it was looking at speech that they didn't like. So they talked about people bringing speakers that were anti-Israel to campus in their view. They talked about classroom texts that were assigned. So it was all going after the academic enterprise and speech on campus, saying this made the Jewish students feel unsafe. All those cases lost. So what did they do at that point? They then decided to go to the University of California and asked the University of California to adopt the definition and apply it to their campus. And when that didn't happen, actually almost 3 years ago, they went to Congress and pushed something called the Antisemitism Awareness Act that basically said for Title VI purposes, you have to consider this definition of anti-Semitism. It passed the Senate unanimously. And then everybody said, what's going on here? The House ended up not looking at it, got postponed for 2 years. And it's interesting, there are people that are Democrats that are supportive of using the definition, and Republicans, and there were Republicans and Democrats who oppose it on free speech grounds. But it seems what happened was when it stalled, they decided to work around with the executive order. So the executive order replaces what the legislation does, and it empowers the scheme of ZOA and others. And Ken Marcus is now in the Department of Education, was promoting these lawsuits when he was running the Brandeis Center. So what is the implication of that? Well, think of a parallel. Okay. If you were going to go and do a Title VI case on the basis of racism, you'd look at whether somebody was selected based on who they are, whether there's intimidation, harassment. You wouldn't have to look at speech. If you were going to go and look at speech and have a standard definition of what racism was, would you have opposition to affirmative action? Would you have desire to leave Confederate statues up on campus and so forth? You wouldn't want to do that because that says that there's a certain preferred definition of what racism is that people in government would have to actually access as they're evaluating these claims to consider it. That's, to me, the purpose here is to get the anti-Israel speech to see, to put it inside the definition, some of which is, some of which isn't, but using it as a way to really stop pro-Palestinian speech. And the impact is not only on pro-Palestinian advocacy, and I agree with Ellie, there are some things at SJP that I find personally very disturbing, but they have a right to their political point of view of it and expression. But it's going to harm Jewish students. And how is it going to harm Jewish students? It's going to make it so that it's going to be perceived that Jewish students have a reputation for trying to silence speech rather than answer it. It's going to harm Jewish students because Jewish studies faculty know that groups like ZOA are going to really monitor what they're teaching, what speakers are bringing to campus, and threaten lawsuits. And even if they don't bring lawsuits, you know how administrators work. They're paid to basically protect the university from harm. So if there's a potential allegation that some speech they see as pro-Palestinian or anti-Israel, and they don't either try to suppress it or at least condemn it, they're opening themselves up to lawsuits. So that's really going to chill the whole enterprise. And the thing that's most distressing to me is that, a college campus ought to be a place where one gets disturbed by ideas, where one wrestles with ideas, when one invites ideas that may shake you to your core. But you figure out when you're 18 to 22, this is how I'm going to deal with it because I'm going to be, disturbed by ideas in the world. And what this is saying is we're undermining the whole enterprise and saying certain ideas, by their very nature, create a harassing environment for students. And I think that's harmful to everybody. So that's the quick background.
Thank you so much for that incredibly comprehensive background, Ken. For those just tuning in now, we're joined by Kenneth Stern, who is the director of the Bard Center for the Study of Hate, former director of the Division of Anti-Semitism and Extremism at the American Jewish Committee, and has a forthcoming book, The Conflict Over the Conflict, the Israel-Palestine Campus Debate. Feel free to comment with questions on our Facebook broadcast leave a question in the Q&A on our Zoom call, or you can also email questions to info@jstreet.org. Now, Ken, the timing of this executive order is pretty jarring. It comes out 1 week after Trump used anti-Semitic tropes in his address to the IAC, and the ADL recently reported that almost all of the violent anti-Semitic murders that we've seen in the past 2 years have emanated from far-right white nationalist sources. Why do you think the White House has chosen to focus on college campuses, and have they done anything at all to show that they're genuinely concerned about the rise of white nationalist extremism?
Well, that's a great question. I think there are two streams associated with this. I think one is that, as I said, this has been an attempt by the Jewish right in particular, unfortunately now joined by the ADL and the HAC, to focus on the campus. So it's not like it's just come out of the blue. But I think Trump perceives that he is responding to something that Jews will like. So there was obviously a political calculation in this. But one of the things that was most distressing to me personally, precisely because of the violence we've seen over the last year in Pittsburgh and in Poway, and if you think more expansively about it, the same ideas that drove Bowers to shoot in Pittsburgh were the ones that drove John Earnest.
Oh, I'm sorry, Ken. We're still having audio issues. If you wouldn't mind,
okay,
closer to the mic, thank you.
Okay. And if you want, tell me if you want me to put on headphones too. I can, pause and do that. Anyway, so I said the reason that we've had the last year or so or two a number of anti-Semitic, really horrible crimes of people that have been driven by white supremacy, that feel empowered by the verbiage of the president, dividing the world into an us versus them. And then you have these folks saying, okay, well, I'm going to act on it. And it's the same type of ideology that led somebody to go in Pittsburgh as it led somebody to go and shoot Mexicans in Walmart. Just a question of which target they wanted to use. So it troubled me that at this, Hanukkah celebration, that when you've had Jews that have died because of the increased thinking of us versus them, and anti-Semitism always thrives when there's an us versus them. Sooner or later, Jews are going to be blamed for something, as we saw, that they were absolutely silent, but they're worried about words promoting anti-Semitism. It would have been useful for people in that room, privately, if not publicly, to challenge the fact that, in my view, the president's words have given encouragement to people who wish Jews harm and wish others harm based on who they are. And that's the disconnect for me. I don't expect President Trump to do any differently than he did. But the problem is that when people in the Jewish community, I see this on both sides of the political aisle, allow somebody's perception of Israel that they agree with to diminish their concern about anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitism comes from the right and the left. That's a problem. We should never let anti-Semitism get a free pass. And I think it's especially incumbent upon all of us when we're in one political camp or another to call it out on our sides too. And that's what did not happen in the White House.
Thanks so much. I'm going to add in a question from the audience here in terms of what are the implications beyond college campuses and this reach of the executive order? Could it have implications beyond campus life?
Well, I think it may. I think what we're going to see is more and more effort to really characterize speech about Israel as anti-Semitic when it may not be. Look, I'm a Zionist. I've been a Zionist, my whole life. But I think Kushner's article in the New York Times said a lot. He's saying he's trying to make it so that anti-Zionism is by definition anti-Semitism. Well, that's a complex thing. I think some anti-Zionism is expressed as anti-Semitism. I think you can make the argument that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism in effect, because Jews are not going to give up sovereignty in Israel and go away peacefully. You don't care about how many Jews are going to be killed in the process. But, we don't call Satmar Jews who are anti-Zionist, anti-Semites. And a lot of young activists I know, students, are very concerned about Israel because of their Jewish identity and may be speaking out about, I don't agree with BDS, but they may be there partly because of that reason. I think it's really frightening when we're having an internal discussion in the Jewish community that I don't know that ever can be solved about whether support for Israel is a necessary part of Jewish identity. But I'm really scared when the government is in the position of making that determination for us. And I think we should all be scared about that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ken. Do you have thoughts on what would be more productive ways for the government to address the rising threat of anti-Semitism?
Well, it's a variety of ways, but I don't think it's only just on the government. I think the government should be doing more. I think one of the things it should be doing less is saying things and doing things that I think create and cultivate the environment in which anti-Semitism is inevitable. So it's not just Trump with the anti-Semitic tropes, and there's some fine people among the folks at Charlottesville that give steam to the far right. If you're asking me about what type of language I would like to see stop out of the current administration, tied totally into the parochial concerns about anti-Semitism, it would be about anti-Muslim and anti-Hispanic views. Remember, Bowers walked into that synagogue and killed 11 Jews because he was worried about invaders. It's that type of language that vilifies others. And if you look historically at anti-Semitism, that's where it thrives the most. So I would like, instead of focusing on magic bullets and executive orders, I would like to stop the us versus them type of verbiage, because I think that's potentially deadly. So that's one thing. I think the idea of the government trying to pass laws that stop speech is a problem too. You want to encourage speech. You want to encourage speech that rejects hate. But when you have basically a rule that says this is the type of yardstick we're going to use about hatred, it disempowers the other things that you want happening in society, because you feel the government is now taking care of it. So I think if you're looking at the campus in particular, there are things that you want to happen on a campus. There are very few full semester classes on anti-Semitism. There are very few programs that really look at how people hate, why they hate, and what to do about it, and how to take what we know from different fields and apply it not only inside the campus, but also in society as well. I think that there are classes in terms of how do you have discussions about deeply divisive issues that should be looked at as well. So I don't think there's a magic bullet for the government to do more. I think in some ways on this, we'd all be well off if the government did less. And when you pass laws that say this is the way we're going to deal with it, it really disempowers everybody from doing this. Again, to talk about the administrators now worried on a campus about getting sued and what am I going to do to stop us from getting sued? I'd rather that the administrator focus on what other programs can we bring in, what kind of new teaching, how should we encourage our students to feel comfortable about disagreeing about gut issues like Israel-Palestine.
Thank you so much, Ken. We are going to ask that you put on a pair of headphones. We're still unfortunately having audio issues, but this next question is for Dylan Williams, the Senior Vice President of Government Affairs at J Street. So we've got some time. So Dylan, the executive order didn't come out of nowhere. There were some failed attempts before this passed in Congress. What is the state of this issue in Congress right now?
Thanks, Rikki. And as Kenneth said, the only reason we are seeing this executive order now, in addition to whatever PR attempt the president was trying to make after his own use of anti-Semitic tropes the preceding weekend, the fact is this legislation has stalled in Congress. The so-called Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, as Kenneth noted, randomly passed one afternoon on the floor of the Senate, almost without anyone realizing what it was or what it said at the end of Congress. And that's why it was cleared by unanimous consent. And literally, I think most offices took a look at the title and said, well, who wouldn't be against increasing awareness and combating anti-Semitism? And of course, that is what is so disingenuous about part of the motivation for this legislation and this executive order is it purports to tackle a problem like anti-Semitism that is a very real problem, but then cynically focuses on a very narrow slice of activity and speech and is much more geared, as Kenneth said, explained in detail, towards quashing criticism of Israel. Even if we find that criticism offensive, sometimes it is still protected speech. In Congress, what happened in the following that passage by the Senate is that all eyes turned to the House of Representatives as to whether or not they too are going to pass this legislation. And thanks to the efforts of experts like Kenneth, like other academics, like free speech advocates, including the ACLU, and quite importantly, and thanks to advocates and student leader advocates like those at J Street U, this bill did not gain enough traction to pass the House of Representatives. And I really want to highlight the role here of J Street U in terms of J Street's efforts joining in the coalition against this legislation. Our lobby team really acted as the conduits for the voice and views of our student leaders and our student activists, saying them directly to Congress. And it was letters from our J Street U leaders that were actually in the hands of senior members of Congress during the hearing that I know Kenneth remembers very well, that was described, I think, accurately by some in the media as an inter-family food fight among Jewish Americans, trying to resolve this unresolvable questions about how Jewish identity relates to Israel, but dealing with a piece of legislation that essentially asked the United States Congress to do it. And that is, of course, what is so dangerous and particularly inappropriate about this president wading into it and making those decisions, those types of decisions for us. So in Congress, I think this legislation is well stalled, but of course, we now have an executive order to deal with. And I think subsequent administrations are going to have to take a very hard look about whether and how quickly they want to change the substance of that order.
Thanks, Dylan. Our next question is coming from the audience, really potentially for both of you. Another question about the timing of the executive order. So the question we have is, isn't the timing of the executive order really all about the elections and the administration's effort to peel off Jewish voters who would normally vote Democrat to either stay home in 2020 or vote for Republicans? And Kenneth, I'm particularly interested to hear, you've talked a bit about how you see this issue as dividing the Jewish community and like that sort of wedge, and how you see this play out, not just in the election, but beyond. And would love to hear from both of you on this question.
Sure. I think that certainly that has to be a part of it in terms of look at all the things that Trump has done in terms of trying to cultivate support in the Jewish community, from moving the embassy to, withholding aid Palestinians to the Iran nuclear deal and to this too. But that being said, I'm not that, cynical to say that, but for that impetus, this would not have happened. I really do think that there were a bunch of people on the right wing of the Jewish community who have made this idea of institutionalizing this definition for this purpose sort of a sacred goal. And Dylan is right. I mean, there were people in the House in particular, and they were from both sides. There were, people concerned about academic freedom. I think I agree with him completely that J Street's advocacy was helpful. I still remember Nadler, who's supporting of this legislation, still was holding up a thing that he got from J Street U in the middle of the House Judiciary Committee, and saying that it's a contentious issue. So I think that there are people, like I said, there are people on both sides that were, stalling this. And I think what happened is over the summer, the best I can tell, they figured that this is not going to happen and this is a good end run around. So, those two things don't need to be mutually exclusive. I think, it's a political calculation, but I think even without that political calculation, they would have figured out this is the way they wanted to go.
Thanks so much, Ken. I'm hearing that folks can hear you loud and clear who are watching.
Thank you. I'm sorry I couldn't before.
No, of course. I think to go back to a question, and you
Sure.
have touched on this, but especially for folks who can hear a little louder now, you wrote the definition of anti-Semitism. Why are you so opposed to the way the executive order is applying the work you've done in the past on college campuses?
Well, as I explained at the beginning, that the definition was drafted, and I was the lead drafter, so I did most of it in the coordination. There were other people other experts that had their hand in it. But the major purpose, it wasn't the sole purpose, but the major purpose was precisely because there was anti-Semitic attacks in Europe, and there needed to be a common frame of reference for data collectors. There were, again, other uses I used for police training in Europe and other things too, but that was the major thing. There was never a discussion there about let's somehow regulate speech on campus through this. Now, one of the things you mentioned, I was at 25 years at the American Jewish Committee. And one of the responsibilities I had was working on issues of the campus. And the first report I did was, how do you deal with bigotry on campus? This is back at the time, late 80s, early 90s, when the hate speech codes were pretty ubiquitous. There were attempts to regulate speech on campus. And the report I wrote after a lot of investigation, talking to a lot of college presidents, including a lot of Jewish college presidents, came to the conclusion that you will never fight bigotry on campus by suppressing speech, that academic freedom is important, that what you want to do is find things that enhance academic freedom as part of your regimen for combating speech, surveys, classes, trainings, and so forth. So I have a very negative reaction to just how the idea of a hate speech code works on a campus. This was an attempt to take this definition and abuse it as a hate speech code. And again, it's not new. I mean, I actually saw the first inklings of this back in 2010 and spoke about it at a conference and been writing about it since. The academy ought to be a place, as I said before, where students and faculty wrestle with ideas that they find incredibly disturbing, and to create instruments of state to suppress speech which we don't like is incredibly harmful. And if you look at larger, you asked before about beyond the campus, look at the history of attempts to suppress speech. You had the McCarthy era. You had attempts to silence speech during the Vietnam War protests. You had attempts to silence speech, I remember as a youngster during the civil rights movement. Whenever you give the government the attempt to define which speech it likes and which speech it doesn't like, that's a danger, because at the end of the day, the government is going to decide to cut out speech that it doesn't like, not that we don't like.
Thanks so much, Ken. And then the next question we have is from Susan Scott. Is there any effort to challenge the executive order in the courts, or are there other ways that folks are responding to this?
Well, I think there's responses, politically about how people find this to be reprehensible. I mean, one of the things that's interesting by lack. When I was at AJC in 2002, I put together a letter that was signed by over 200 college presidents about intimidation of Zionists on campus. In 2007, there were 400 some odd college presidents that put together a statement that was initially written by Lee Bollinger, the president of Columbia, against the academic boycott. I have not seen one college president say this is a good idea. I don't know that they're going to come out and speaking against it, but the lack of saying this is something we need in our campuses, I think, is something telling and people should pay attention to. I have no doubt that when the right case comes along, that either the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education or the ACLU or some other group, the Center for Constitutional Rights, Palestine Legal, I don't know who, but somebody will challenge it. It's, again, as my background as a lawyer, you want to wait for the best facts to assert the case. And I suspect too, if the election comes out and Trump is not in the White House in 2020, one of the things that I think will be on the plate will be to re-examine this executive order. I think the idea of including Jews and Sikhs and Muslims under Title VI protection is one that I think everybody agrees with. Certainly when it comes to intimidation and harassment, you can come to some nuances of differences about discrimination. But the major problem is the use of the definition this way. I would hope that that would be one of the things that would be remedied early in 2021.
Thanks. On that note, we're seeing a few questions from people who are interested in some of the early reports of the executive order talked about defining Judaism as a nationality. And if we could just hear from you about what exactly is going on in the executive order there.
Right, I saw that was the the reaction. I think it was mostly from how the New York Times characterized it. I did, I saw a different language used in the executive order than in that 2010 Dear Colleague letter, but I did not see a major shift in emphasis. I did not see it as, to me, the trying to define anti-Semitism or Jews in a way that was necessarily problematic. I thought it was just trying to, by using different language, to keep the protections of the 2010 letter. And what was problematic to me, again, was the using of the definition, saying the government approves of this particular definition of anti-Semitism and encouraging people to apply it.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for that clarification. Another question we're getting a lot is about the response from Jewish institutions across the board has been varied and not particularly clear. Sort of what does that say about the state of the Jewish community? Is the split within diaspora jury widening? How do you see this playing out?
Well, again, I see there's so much in the sort of people jumping into one camp or another camp about the discussions about Israel. And, it doesn't surprise me that you see ZOA and AMCA and the other, traditional groups on the right. What's really sort of, depressing to me is seeing some of the mainstream groups going in on this. And it's not new. I mean, in 2010, I wrote a letter that came out of the process inside of AJC, inside of the legal committee, that was opposing ZOA's attempts to use the definition in this way. And it was, through staff, through the legal committee, and the pushback, and it was jointly done with the president at the time, Carrie Nelson, of the American Association of University Professors. But the pushback was so vociferous that AJC actually withdrew support from that statement at that time. So there are people for whom, I mean, it's one of the things in my book, that question, that was just asked really resonated with me as I was writing the book. And there's a lot of social psychology and moral philosophy and other things that I'm in the Hate Study Center that I run that are useful to think about how people think about things when their identity is tethered to an issue of perceived social justice. There's even neuroscience about this. And I think that we get into our own little bubbles and camps, and we feel just so, self-righteous about it. And then we try to weaponize things against one side or the other side. And I think the organized mainstream Jewish community is seeing that people are getting, want to protect Jewish students, don't like anti-Semitism. Those are all good things, but then decide that a tool like this therefore has to be important for the same reason Dylan was saying that the bill first went through the Senate. Who could be opposed to fighting anti-Semitism? And rather than saying, wait a minute, let's step back and understand how campuses work, what's likely to be the effect, do we really believe this? They're just saying, okay, this just sounds strong, and that to me is a shame. And part of the reasoning, I think, is that a number of years ago, at least when I was working in the organized Jewish community, there was an attempt before jumping onto anything dealing with a campus to convene people that lived on the campus, college presidents and provosts and deans, and have conversations about, is this really what we want to do? And do we understand the institution you're living in? And do we understand its values? Is this going to backfire? And my suspicion is we're having less of those conversations, and it's to our detriment.
Thanks so much, Ken. A very pragmatic, usable question from Philip Chonigman. Many in the community are confused as to why the executive order is problematic, because for so many of us it is like, well, of course I want to stand against anti-Semitism. Do you have a one-sentence response to really drive home the point with friends or family who think it's okay?
Yeah, that the way to suppress anti-Semitism is not to create the narrative that Jews are trying to silence people that oppose them on Israel. The way to do it is to say, on a campus, let's bring in more thinking. Let's bring in more speakers. Let's talk about how do we do difficult discussions. Let's talk about, Zionism and anti-Zionism. Let's have classes in anti-Semitism. The campus really has great tools for dealing with this issue, but the idea of suppressing speech that we don't like, will never work, especially on a campus, and it never works in society as well. It creates this this type of backlash where it turns people that we may disagree with into free speech martyrs, and that makes it even more difficult to combat the speech we don't like.
Thanks so much. I hope that's helpful for everyone watching. I know I'm thinking about how I'm going to use that message when I talk to students for sure. Another question from Rick Kane. Would it help from your position as one of the authors involved with the definition of anti-Semitism that is being used in such a different way from your intention? Would it help for you to draft and offer an amended definition that a future administration might adopt?
The answer to that is no. Let me explain why. I think any definition is problematic. The idea of let's look at certain speech and then use that as a way to see whether we're going to penalize campuses related to Title VI cases is a problem. So I can't see any definition that would be useful. Again, the analogy I had before about racism, would opposition to affirmative action, would you include that or not? And the challenge when you have a definition. My colleague Andy Baker, who's in favor of this legislation, was also testifying at the Judiciary Committee. And one of the more interesting back and forths was that Chairman Goodlatte was saying to my colleague Andy Baker who said the definition was needed because anti-Semitism changes over time. And Goodlatte said, well, that seems to me a reason why you wouldn't want a definition, because you'd always go back and have to revisit it. So think about it. Is there a definition, any definition, even one that I might, agree with for this purpose, which I wouldn't, but the point is, would there, be unanimous opinion inside the Jewish community and inside and outside the community? We would never get, an agreement on that. And I think it's not the role of the government to define homophobia, to define anti-Semitism, to define racism, to define sexism for the purpose of looking at speech, as opposed to other types of things like workplace discrimination and so forth. I don't think you would have any definition that would be okay.
Thank you so much, Ken Stern. For those of you who missed, Ken is the director for the Bard Center for the Study of Hate and was the director on anti-Semitism at the American Jewish Committee. He has a forthcoming book coming out, The Conflict on the Conflict, the Israel-Palestine campus debate. This video has been recorded and will be available online at J Street's Facebook. Feel free to reach out to Ken directly to ask him any questions. Ken, if you want to share the best way to contact you.
Sure, I invite anybody who wants to continue the conversation at any time. You just email me. My email is kstern, it's KSTERN, at bard, BARD.edu. Again, Ken Stern, or kstern, excuse me, at bard.edu.
Thanks so much, Ken. And again, the video will be available at Facebook, and you do not need a Facebook profile to watch the video on our J Street page. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And thanks so much, Ken Stern, again.
Thank you, Rikki. Thank you, Dylan.
Thank you all.
Bye.